Now I'm going to present the book Living Complexity, that it's a catalog of practices inspired by complexity thinking. These practices are useful for everyday software and digital products development. My journey in complexity started around 2004. At that time, a few agile teams were starting to see repeated success in adopting agile, and those teams started to wonder why agile was successful, and also the community was starting to question, to think about what are the foundations of agile, what is the theory behind this agile success. And at that time, Joseph was the first to introduce to the agile community the idea of complexity and connecting complexity with the agile way of working. Since then, in my journey into complexity, I've read about different authors and different models, some that are harder to find. And then I selected some of those models and practices that are relevant for software and digital product development. Another work that I've done that is to blend together those models with a coherent language. Complexity is pretty new, and because of that, different authors may use a slightly similar terms that have slightly different meaning. So in this book, especially for those that are new to complexity, you find a quite wide overview of complexity models in a way that is easy accessible. This book in general is for leaders, managers, facilitators such as Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, and of course all the team members. The content of the book is based on the work of Joseph PELRINE that I mentioned before for introducing complexity to the Agile community. Dave Snowden, that we know very well for his work on around Kinavin, Dr. David Albert, Ralph Stacey, and many others that are quoted and referenced into the book. Also, we have two special contributions from Dean Lachana and LADCnet that they wrote their own practices and contributed with their own practices to the book. The original version of the book was a pretty raw catalog, a small catalog of practices, but then thanks for the feedback from many people, thanks for their precious feedback, the initial catalog grew up to the current version of the book. I mentioned again Joseph, Dave Snowden, Sunil Mundra, the author of Enterprise Agility, as well as other ex-co-workers from ThoughtWorks and other fellow Agilists from the Agile community. So in the book, there are two key ideas that I think they are radical, or at least they are different from the traditional literature that you find on complexity out there. The traditional literature that you find on complexity is pretty theoretical. Instead, in this book, you find, in my opinion, a radical shift of the center of gravity of the conversation around complexity, from the theory to the practice. A lot of people that start to approach new ideas like to approach new ideas starting with practical example and actual practice. And this is what this book does, give them the opportunity to start to look into complexity, starting with practical application. But also for those of us that started to read a lot the literature on complexity out there that is quite theoretical, even for us, those practices are an opportunity to introduce complexity to other team members and to the rest of the organization. It comes into my mind a quote from David Marquette: act your way into a new way of thinking, starting with the practice. Another thing that is peculiar from this book is that many of the literature on complexity out there refer to complex systems where the agents are mathematical models, molecules, like in chemistry, cells from biology, or insect, flocks and swarm. But what is peculiar in this book is that it focuses on a complex system where the agents are human beings. And for me, this is important. First of all, because the agents that we meet in the organization are indeed a human being. But then also because human beings have peculiar characteristics that are unique compared to other agents and other complex systems. For example, every agent, every individual is unique. And then we have free will, spontaneity, and agency. It means that we are driven by more than our instinct for survival or reproduction. We are driven by more than our need, our goals, or our pleasure. And then, like other agents, yes, we have memory and we learn. But as a human being, we also co-create new knowledge and share knowledge. And that again make us unique. And that uniqueness gives us a complete new way to look at how organization are made up and how organization work compared to the view that we can get from other non-human complex systems. The practices in the book and in the catalog are organized in three groups. The first group of practices focus around the idea that we are complex, we as individuals and the teams. The second group of practices focus around the idea that the work that we do may be complex. And so it is useful to estimate the complexity of the work that we do and adapt the way of working based on the actual complexity. And finally, the group of practices in part 3 focus on the idea that the whole organization may be complex. When I ask people to mention practice inspired from complexity, sometimes people mention Kinevin. But Kinevin actually is a framework, not a practice, in the same way that extreme programming or Scrum are framework. When I ask again to mention a practice inspired by complexity, sometimes people answer probing or ritual descent. But those again are techniques like dot voting is a technique that we use often in Agile. They are not practice. A practice is something that can be done by a group of people with a specific purpose. A practice has a specific input and specific output or outcomes. An example of a practice from Agile could be the retrospective. Another practice from complexity could be 4-point method. For example, that is one of the practices described in the book. All the practices are described in 5 sections. The first one, overview, is what we need to know before continue reading about the practice. Then we have the purpose, relation to complexity, that explain what is the actual relation between the practices complexity theory, and the main section, the description, where the practice is described and explained. And then the last section provide practical tips and stories, basically ideas and suggestions on how to apply the practice in real life. Talking about self-organization, a self-organizing system that is well known is the weather system. The weather system can produce a beautiful summer as well as a natural disaster. Self-organization left alone can go either way. And this is why in an organization, we may want to orient self-organization toward desirable and beneficial outcome. So all the practices in part 1 focus on self-organization and on ways to try to orient self-organization toward desirable outcomes. Human self-organization, from a complexity theory point of view, is a social process of local interaction that lead to the emergence of population-wide patterns. It is a spontaneous process, and it happened because our social nature as a human being. It is a process that happened between people such as employees, consultants, customers, supplying, constantly and continuously relating with each other. We negotiate the meaning of what's happening around us. We negotiate who we want to be at work and what we want to do. And then we have this local interaction. For example, conversation that two team members can have with each other, or two co-workers debating a solution or an idea. This local interaction take place during ordinary everyday of work, ordinary conversation and action. And then we have population-wide patterns that emerge as a result of all these local interaction coming together. An example of a population-wide pattern is tension forming during a company merger, for example. The population-wide pattern is not the result of some global policy, global law, or predefined action, but instead is the result of those ongoing local interaction, always happening in the current present. So they cannot be designed or engineered up front. What can an organization do in relation to this spontaneous ongoing self-organization? Well, an organization can decide a way of working and take action that may hinder or frustrate self-organization. And this may potentially lead to dysfunctional dynamics. Or an organization can support and promote self-organization, maintaining the possibility of exploiting the potential of self-organization. The 11 principles of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development mention self-organization. The architecture and ultimately the best product emerge from self-organizing team. The meaning of self-organization from complexity science is slightly different, but there is a relation between the two. And the relation is important because based on that relation, we understand if and how we can use the finding from complexity theory in agile software development. And this is one of the topics that is covered in detail in the book. Talking about the self-organization, Joseph Perlin introduced a few models around self-organization that are documented in the book, and also introduced the idea of using dials or control knobs that one can tweak in order to influence the dynamic of a self-organizing system and of the team. Joseph introduced this concept of control knobs and also the prerequisite for self-organization, four prerequisites. The first one is critical mass. In a team, we need at least 3 members in order to have enough local interaction to lead to the emergence of global patterns. The more people we have, the more emergence and the self-organization can happen. Then we have diversity and dissent. Well, in many organizations, there is a focus on collaboration and harmony, but complexity science and self-organization pointed to the importance of diversity together with inclusivity and dissent. Without the diversity and dissent, we can fall victim of groupthink as well as blind spot. And then the environment intended as a space and the time where the work happened. The environment need to be big enough to leave enough room for maneuver to the team members so they can actually self-organize, but also be small enough so that the team members cannot avoid each other. You may have observed or been part of one of those teams where they do come together, for example, during the stand-up or during a retrospective or planning meeting. But then during the day, every team members just work on their own task. And the only way that they interact is handing over the work. That is an example where there is too much space in the environment and team members avoid each other. And then finally, letting people do it, allowing people to interact, to have those local interactions, to come to conclusion and apply those conclusions in the way that they work. In the basic model, Joseph Perlin started to introduce 3 control knobs: team size, boundaries, and roles. Team size, for example, if you reduce the team size, you may make the team more receptive to new ideas. The smaller the team is, the easier it is for the member, for example, to reach consensus on trying and experimenting a new idea. The boundaries define who is inside the team and who is outside. Those inside the team can have more frequent interactions and then can have more deeper interaction, where the interaction between those that are inside and outside the team are less frequent and less intense. And then we have roles. The roles that we attach to people can activate an identity. An example of using roles is through Scrum, where Scrum decomposes the project manager roles into Scrum Master and Product Owner. And that's a way to drive new behavior. Joseph Perlin suggested to use these, and in general, all control knobs as things that we can tweak in order to try to influence the dynamic of the team. And if the result is positive, we can try to keep that change or even amplify it. If we see that that leads to a dynamic that is undesirable, we can dump down or reverse that change. Overall, part 1 introduced 6 practices and about 20 control knobs. You can also see that part 1 introduced the concept of agility, and the book explains the relation between complexity and agility. So here again, we have the approach that we use when dealing and tweaking those control knobs. And the approach is try to amplify beneficial dynamics and reverse the dynamics that are detrimental. Another learning that is important, especially for leaders and managers, is that inside the organization, there are no privileged vantage point. There is not an objective point of view or a place where even a senior manager or a senior leader can grasp a complete view and a complete understanding of the systems and of the organization. For these reasons, it's important that leaders, managers, as well as facilitators, include the whole team and everyone that is affected by the work that we are doing in the process. Use everyone as a human sensor so that we gain the point of view of all the people involved and we achieve a point of view that is broader and more complete. Another element is that the team members and system have memory, disposition, and propensity, and every experiment can alter this disposition. This is important because we don't want to go crazy like a mad scientist and suddenly try to change all those control knobs and do one experiment after the other. Instead, it's important to start with observing the forces at work in the self-organizing system and develop situational awareness. Another suggestion is to involve the team members and those that are affected by the work to do. Involve them in the decision of which experiment to enact, involve them in enacting the experiment and in observing the result. That is the preferred approach, except for a few exceptions. And then, as I mentioned before, when we work with those control knobs, when we tweak them, the approach is a trial and error. It is not possible to know upfront what will be the outcome of making a change or tweaking a control knob. We can have an idea, but in the end, we cannot be certain, and we cannot design or engineer the intervention up front. What we have to do, again, is to observe the result. And if it is positive, we can keep it and amplify it. If it is negative, we can reverse it. This is important when we think about organization and traditional organization. People that are used to deal with a lot of simple problems tend to see all problems as people that are used to deal with a lot of complex problems, or people that love complexity tend to see all problems as complex. And this is because we tend not to see what we don't expect to see, and also because of other cognitive biases. And for these reasons, the practices in part two that enable us to estimate the real degree of complexity of the work that we have at hand are extremely valuable. Estimating the complexity of the work is very important. In the organization, there are many possible systems that may be complex. Think about the social relationship between people, individuals, teams, department, branches of the organization. Or think about users and customers, tech-savvy and hyper-connected, that through their devices, they are also connected to marketplace and the technological ecosystem. Or think about the technological components, the code base, the software module, the service, the infrastructure, and the internet. So those are those are systems in the organization that are potentially complex. And then we have the work to do, the delivery initiative that also can be complex and can lead to a complex dynamic. Think about the requirement, ambiguous, fragmented, incompleted. Think about competing priorities, shifting goals, or the technology that is used in order to implement the solution with the potential huge number of systems, massive code base, sometimes a legacy code base, technical debt, fragile integration, and continuously evolving new technology. Or people's collaboration dynamics, creativity that are unpredictable and uncontrollable, as well as potential problems such as misaligned goals and incentive, conflicting interest, and so on. So what is really happening is that in the organization we have, you see on the right, a potentially complex system like people and technology, and then we have the work to do that is like the energy that fuel those systems and may or may not lead to a complex dynamic. One of the practices to estimate complexity, to estimate the degree of complexity, is the one described by Leith Keogh that suggests this point of view, suggests to ask this question: who in the world has done this before? And with this, I mean a feature to be implemented, the problem to be solved, the user story. And if you look at number 5, the possible answer, nobody in the world has done this. Or number 1, we all know how to do it. Everybody knows how to do it. Leith suggested to start to focus initially on the 5s and 4, because there are the more innovative ideas and the ones that are potentially more profitable. But there is also more uncertainty, unknowns that deserve to be explored first. Instead, if you look at the ones, for example, those problems, they may have been commoditized. You may even be able to procure them as a service or as a standard component. Overall, in the part 2 of the book, there are 6 practices described. Some of them, as I say, provide you different way to estimate the degree of complexity, while others describe a different way to adapt the way of working and what you do based on the actual degree of complexity. Plus, from part 1, some of the practices also suggest a way to adapt based on the degree of complexity. The different practices to sense complexity start from very simple, the one that you can use to introduce the basic concept of complexity to the team. And then there are more advanced practices that can be used later with the team. The third part is about the whole organization. Three fundamental dynamics of complexity, of human complexity, are co-creation, co-evolution, and emergence, sometimes referred as a simplicity because some complex systems start to evolve from simple systems. And among them, co-creation is one of the common dynamics common among the practices in part 3. Co-creation is a collaboration pattern that is particularly effective when dealing with complexity. McIntyre, that he is a philosopher, suggests that we human beings are storytelling animals. And this is very important because through storytelling, we communicate and determine who we are, but we also share knowledge through storytelling, and we can also co-create new knowledge through storytelling. Complexity can be a challenge, but it can also be an opportunity. Organizations that are complex are more susceptible, are more likely to be influenced by complexity, but at the same time, they are better suited to cope and exploit complexity. And McChrystal suggests that you take a network to compete with the network. When you look at the practices in part 3, you may realize, oh, I also know this agile practice or that agile practice that could also be included in part 3. And this is because agile, as well as complexity, is based on the same 3 key pillars: co-creation, co-evolution, and simplicity. Those are the 3 practices that are described in the book in part 3. And this is a list of key concepts that you will find described in the book. At the end, you also find an appendix, especially for those new to complexity, where you can find a list of additional resources to learn more about complexity. And finally, here, well, you got the QR code to get the discounted copy of the book. And I think Corrado will quickly share the link in the chat. I think this completes the frontal presentation of the book, and this leads us to the extraction of the copy, and also to question and answer on Slido. So, Corrado, how do you want to proceed?
Yeah, I think that, Luca, if you can access to the Slido, there are already some questions. I think that the most relevant is just on the top. Can you access the link?
Yes. Where is the beer? Oh my God. Thank you, Joseph. No beer for me. Any comment from you, Joseph? Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still there. I saw somebody muted me. Hi. So, actually, I'm drinking wine, but that's late. Yeah.
Any comment from you? Any other comment that you want to add? I quoted a lot of your work, so I don't know if you want to say something yourself.
Yeah. It's your talk, it's your book, which I find excellent. I'm looking at the few questions. And the thing, from which academic discipline does complexity theory in general come from? It is a theory in itself, and it is a whole science. Basic mathematical complexity theory comes from cybernetics from the 1950s. The big change that Snowden and others brought was the idea of social complexity system realizing that people are not mathematical models because we have the so-called free will, because of a number of other things that you cover in your book. But that's the problem, is that if the behavior of the agents in the system is non-deterministic, which means you can't predict it, it's very difficult to plan a mathematical model that can predict the outcomes of any such behavior. And this is where the idea comes that you go away from planning certain outputs to setting the conditions that good outcomes can happen. Carlo's question, days, weeks, and months. How long should we wait to see the effects of our tweakings? That's an excellent question, which I can't answer because it's context specific. It depends on the design of your interventions. Carlo, thank you for asking that question. It depends on the interventions, and what you're trying to do is, if you think as a psychologist, as a scientist, we all know scientific method. Scientific method says you come up with a hypothesis, and then what you learn at university is to design the minimum number of experiments necessary to validate or refute that hypothesis whilst controlling for all confounding variables. The thing is that we learn this at university. The question, what we miss is the application of this in business. So if my hypothesis is, if I bring this product to the market, I'll earn a shitload of money. How do we design a series of experiments that will either refute or confirm our hypothesis whilst controlling for all variables? And for this, we need often an experimental object. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that's what I, as a scientist, call an MVP. All it is an experimental object to run your experiments on to validate your hypothesis. How long that takes for that feedback loops depends on the experiment you have. What you want to do, obviously, is make that cycle as shortly as possible, because this is something that Kent at least taught me back in the mid-90s when we started doing this, is the longer your feedback loop is, the more you need to plan in advance. Back when programming meant whopping a stack of punch cards, bringing them to the computer center in the afternoon and picking up your core dump in the morning. If that feedback loop is so long, then you need to plan a lot in advance. That's one of the reasons we invented pair programming, was to be able to get this feedback as quickly as possible. And it's also interesting that one thing that people don't think about is, this is why the waterfall model, or what people understand as Royce's waterfall model, proves the validity of Agile. So if you think of the waterfall model, essentially what you're doing is you're waiting until the end, to the worst possible point, to actually test and validate your hypothesis. So any way you can do that sooner is better for you. And the extreme part, which is, Kent was is still a little bit crazy, I am too, is that, okay, if you only test at the end, then what about if you test a little bit before? That'll be better. What if you test a little bit before? And we said the extreme thing is that, well, what if you start testing before you even write code? What will that tell you? That will tell you that your developers are incompetent because none of the tests pass, because they never write code. They haven't written any yet. And so you write just enough code to pass the tests. And this is what we came up with in 1995. And this is why we started writing things like SUnit, and all the unit testing frameworks that started on that were saying, how can we get the quickest feedback possible in very simple ways? Sorry, Luca, I will shut up. I'll turn off my microphone now. You asked me for an answer and then
was good. Thank you, Joseph. A couple of comments. One comment is about Zach mentioned about the time it takes to learn a new habit. In terms of complexity, we don't try to change the habit of individuals. That's the work of a psychologist, Zach. We try to change the dynamic. So the intervention, the control knob or the dials impact the way that we interact with each other, but they do not try to change the habit of the individual. That's a little different approach. They may lead over time to that change, but that's not the primary approach. The complexity tries to change how we interact with each other. And another quick comment was a point that Joseph made, is that as a human being, there is a degree of unpredictability. The complex system and the emergence cannot be designed or engineered up front. And this has a huge impact on the way that we do things, what we can predict and instead what we need to react. Dan, I saw that you were commenting something on the chat.
Smiling. So that's positive feedback already.
Thank you, Dan. Anything you want to add? I saw, Dan, you were writing on chat. Anything that you want to add live?
I know. I think it's really interesting. The scientist always wants to isolate all the variables, and that absolutely makes sense. And the experimental approach, and I love the way you're describing MVP, Joseph, as well. It's exactly how I do, although I try not to use that anymore because it's become a polluted term. That might mean initial launch couple of 2 years, or it might mean 2 days, or it might mean half an hour to someone who's more used to experiments. But this idea of isolating experiments is so great. Apart from you just can't do it in the business world. So you might isolate all of your different variables. So this is what we're going to do in our marketing plan at McDonald's this month. This is how we're going to market our McTriple Rib Deluxe with cheese, and chili sauce, and then KFC runs out of chicken, as they did in the UK a couple of years ago. And
well, you're not after Brexit. You're not going to get any from the EU anyway. So, sorry, mate.
We're moving on. No, I mean that's the thing. You just can't isolate. And what you were saying just a second, and I think Luca is saying about we change the interactions, not the behaviors of the individual. But of course, changing those interactions and those dynamics will change individual behaviors. It will cause people to act differently. So the problem is humans, right? We're just this in this ecosystem. If it was predictable and easy, you wouldn't need to be thought about. But this is why it's hard, right? This is why it is complex.
Dan, let's say that this argument about looking at this from a scientific point of view is a good starting point and argument for all of us to push MVPs as being what they are, and understanding that most people don't know shit about designing tests. And A/B testing without a valid hypothesis, without having control groups and test groups, is as a psychologist, as a statistician, you have to question the validity of any results. So another thing I want to look at, I'm getting into this now, is Zach says something very important. Changing the environment leads to behavior change. Yeah, this is Levin's theorem. This is something I've been talking about this since 2004. I'm happy that people have finally started picking up on it, although I don't know if they quote the sources. Levin says behavior of a person is a function of the person and their environment. You have two variables that you can change. And this is essentially what I and what Luca bases our theories on, is that you can change the environment and force an environmental change on people. And not only Levin in his theories in 1954 and 1958 papers, but also Clovis Shepard in his book and his papers in the early 60s have proven the validity of Levin's equation, not only for individuals, but also for groups. You change the dynamics of a team by changing their environment. And believe me, as a psychologist, as a coach, it's a lot easier to change the external environment than it is to change the people. Working as a psychologist, I have a lot of pain changing people. But the interesting thing in complexity theory is that you have that, a complex system, behavior evolves, it emerges, it self-organizes as a result of the actions and interactions of the agents with each other and with their environment. And this idea of co-evolution is the fact that the environment influences the agents, their actions and their interactions, but the agents can also influence the environment. So let's get down to it. Which programming language do you work in? Make it very concrete. Which IDE do you work in? What are your shortcuts on your keyboard? Right? That influences the way you work. Which version control system do you use? Do you really use Git? Do you use Subversion? Nothing like that. This influences the way you interact with the other members of your team, right? But on the other hand, you and your team members have the power to change the environment. And this is a fascinating thing. And this is what makes it all non-deterministic and scary for people who want to have control.
Yeah, there is a comment. I saw on the chat some comment between Dean and Zach. We mentioned 6 weeks, 8 weeks to change the human behavior. I think that, again, we are talking about the changing the dynamics of the system, not the changing the individual.
Yeah.
I try to change my own behaviors, and in my case, it takes years. So
yeah. Let's say I agree with Zach. I want to agree with Zach. I say, for simplicity's sake, he's right. As a psychologist, though, I say, okay, there's a lot of other factors that play a role here. Hold on, I'm an old guy. I'm not going to change my behavior.
You can do every day, right?
Yeah, right. So that's the thing. There are a lot of other things. So Zach, I agree totally with you. We just need to quantify those numbers. But thank you.
No, that's a really good example you were saying about changing IDEs and stuff like that. To make this real, I remember when I turned up to Ministry of Justice Digital. Mm-hmm. So this was a good few years ago. But Ministry of Justice Digital in the UK followed the government digital service model back when GDS was kicking off. They were like an offshoot of that. And you turned up on day one and you were issued with a MacBook and you were issued with a Google account rather than a PC eventually, and a Windows, Office, software suite or anything. But it was this thing of, no, we're Macs, we're disruptors, we're different. And that whole concept of I'm a Mac from Steve Jobs and being a disruptor. But it really did make a big difference. On day one, you were not turning up in a suit into the civil service, in the headquarters of the Ministry of Justice. You were turning up in jeans and trainers and you got issued with a Mac. And
but
that was,
I'm a Mac, I'm a disruptor. Effect. That must have been long ago.
No, it was not that long enough. but I think it does make a difference. I think of what some of the other kits, some of the other people I work with in government now have to even work with. Which a MacBook Air from a few years ago would be a good thing. But no, it does have a massive, profound effect. It's like that moment of, oh, it's different here. Yeah. And then you see people act different. And I think it does really make a difference.
I think, Dan, that ties into the identity part of complexity at individuals. Luca said identity, intent, and intelligence. And that's identity. I am part of that tribe. I am different. Yeah. I think differently. And it's kind of, I guess, part of social proof within that kind of cohesive group of people who are doing something which is a bit like they're mavericks. They're there to disrupt and experiment.
Yeah. So,
and it's okay to do that here. Look, we give you this, we reinforce it on day one.
Yeah. Ian, one thing I wanted to point out, you used the term tribe, and I'm hoping you're not using it in terms of whatever people think is the Spotify model. But what you're pointing
to indeed not. No,
let's not go there.
Thank you, mate. But what you're looking at is essentially the elitist inside, outside point. I'm a belonger. And this is what comes up in the abide model in terms of barriers. and boundaries, who's in and who's out. And if you can identify that this is a need that we all have, is to be part of the elite. And how do we define that? And I remember, I'm older than some of you guys, when the first iPod came out. Some of you might not even remember what an iPod is. That was a hard disk that played music. It was a great success until George W. Bush was photographed having one. Yeah, exactly. But this is the thing, is that this is the way that in psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics, we identify not only a dialect, but also a sociolect. That's the slang that a certain group uses to identify themselves as members of that group and as special and close themselves off from others. And it's also interesting in terms of domain-specific languages that certain domain-specific languages are used for the purpose of closing things off. And interesting, going back into Agile archaeology, where the idea of a user story comes from. At least this is a story that Kent told me. Kent and I shared a flat for a number of years, working on some of Europe's first projects. And he said, look, we all know the term use case. This term, that's our secret handshake that we have. And this secret handshake puts us on the other side of the table and separates us from the people who we are trying to help with our work. And what we need to do is to speak the same language. So what the fuck is a use case? A use case is a story of some functionality, of some feature from the point of view of a specific user. Now we would call that a user persona. So you say, why don't we just call it a user story? Put us on the same side of the table. Just tell us your story. The other idea was, okay, let's go 10 years in the future and describe what it's like using the system and then go back. But that's the idea of a user story. And it's unfortunate that, Dean, that this feeling that we have to be something special, we have to be some elite, forces us over and over again to do things that are delineating. And the way to be elite nowadays is to speak Japanese. Well, not Japanese, because none of us can. I don't know if there's anybody speaking Japanese here, but let's start with Kanban, Gemba, Kaizen. Right, this is our secret language once again, which puts a barricade between us and the business and the people we want to help. Come on, Dean. Sorry, Dan, excuse me, Dan. I'm sorry.
So I should out myself as a Kanban University kitty here.
Yeah.
But a few years ago it was now, we decided to make a deliberate move in the Kanban University to move away from Japanese words. Specifically. So we don't talk about Kaizen anymore. We certainly don't talk Mura, all those things we used to talk about years ago. We try and speak in plain English, which is great if you happen to be an English speaker. I get that. But we're trying to simplify the language.
Yeah.
Because exactly that reason. How can we be approachable? How can we not put a barrier between us and the people who need to use this thing? And I think it's interesting when you notice it. Yeah. And perhaps it's part of that, the crossing the chasm. And getting into that early pragmatic adopter group or something. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, but what I just saw, Daffod, why don't you out yourself and turn on your video? He says, as being one of the probably few Welsh people here, the secret languages know how to pronounce Cynefin.
I was just kidding. Most people can say it absolutely fine. It's Cynefin.
Yeah.
The C in Welsh is always like a K in English.
So nice to see you, mate. So happy to see you again.
No, the thing that's always worried me in Welsh is why does Wales sometimes start with a C and sometimes with a G? And I'm sure there's a really good reason for it. Cymru and Cymru.
Yeah.
Okay. About those that post some of the questions on Slido. So someone is asking about if you need to answer the form in order to be picked up in the survey for the raffle of the new book. The answer is yes. If for every reason you cannot answer the Google form, contact Corrado in front of Sacco. Another question from Zord. Zord, are you here?
Yes, right here. Hi, Luca. Hi, everyone.
Hi. You asked a question about way to find out the driving forces of the culture in the organization. Do you want to tell more about your question?
Yes, prompted about all the conversation about complexity. I was wondering, even if in a complex system where certain behaviors emerge, if there are some patterns that everyone accepts and can start from in order to understand more about a system of people, why they behave like this, and where you should focus in order to influence the behavior towards a certain potential result. I don't know.
So two sides of this answer. By one side, you find I think it is the last practice of part 3, a few questions that you can use in order to provoke people in telling story and conversation that are relevant in terms of revealing aspects of their culture. So again, we are going back to the idea of sharing stories, actual stories. And this practice is, I find it powerful. I think I experimented it with the Carlo in few organizations. The power of that practice is simply that those questions are powerful in drawing out stories about the current culture. Mm-hmm. The second part of the question is what you ask is trying to, or at least the language you used in your question, remembered to me the idea of trying to identify the parts, so decomposing the culture and then understanding how the culture works, and then designing an engineering intervention. Actually, from the complexity point of view, you kind of move away from there. You move away and try to engineer things and intervention in the culture, but instead you run experiment. You try to identify the landscape of where you are. You try to make intervention that ideally you think will move people in that direction or in that direction. And you observe, you amplify what works and you dump down what doesn't. But you cannot engineer or intervene up front, design up front an intervention. Any more comments on this? Anyone else that want to comment on this?
One thing that I've been thinking about, some of my latest research in this direction is this. I'm going to give you as a puzzle and a koan for you to think about, is that static and dynamic are not a gradient, or they're not opposites. They go in, they're different vectors. If you think about, we tend to think about static here, dynamic here. But if you give a bunch of young boys a football and put them out on the playing field, the first thing they do is static. They define where the goals are. By defining the boundaries, defining the rules of the game, allows them the dynamics of playing the game. This is something that's been twisting my mind lately quite a lot. The fact that static and dynamic are not necessarily opposites, but they're possibly on different vectors.
Sorry, Joseph, but if they are in a different vectors, as you mentioned, there could be some position that has a code, as a value on both the vectors. So can be at the same moment static and dynamic.
Yeah, so you have the static thing. The amount of static constraints and restrictions that you have will influence the amount of dynamism that you have.
Yeah, but these are actions, not status.
Actions and status.
Sorry, if you are static is a status, dynamic is a status.
Yeah. The question is how far static is also a status and how far change in static. There's a book I recommend that you get. It's a very simple book, about 100 pages, philosophy book that I'll look for the link in Amazon and type it in. It's called Finite and Infinite Games by James Carse. And the interesting thing that Carse writes is that you play finite games to win. You play infinite games to keep playing. And based on that, I see Dan thinking, you're starting to grok that. How the rules, how the basis changes. If you don't want to download it from Amazon, you can find it from LibGen or something like that. Hold it, let me just type it in.
Yeah, I'm putting in the chat the link. I found it.
Okay, Finite and Infinite Games. It's an excellent book. I found it at when I was book shopping at Uppsala around 2002 or something like that. This is, interesting for me. This is a new idea that came up, and I'm trying to map that with my view of the world, which is, of course, totally subjective. But I think that, obviously, but it's an interesting thought that what happens if static and dynamic are not two ends of a gradient, but are orthogonal? How more or less static is the system? How more or less dynamic is the space that we have to play? And how do the two influence each other? Just a thought.
No, thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would love to plumb the depths of the complexity experts here, because I know I'm not. I scratch the surface and make a living out of it. But one thing that came up in a group I was in a while back was degrees of complexity. Now, I understand things, if I just go with Cynefin, because it's a simple one, you go clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. Once something's in complex, and it's a complex problem, can there be degrees within that? Can we say that predicting how many hurricanes will hit West Coast America next year is more or less complex than what's the next pandemic that's going to hit the world? Or curing cancer or cold fusion. They're all
Google
complex
the term,
problems, right?
Lyapunov exponent. Lyapunov exponent is a quantitative descriptor of essentially the amount of chaos in a system. And another thing that I'm starting to dare to say, because I'm an old guy and I'm getting sort of fed up with shutting up about everything, is that complexity is not Cynefin.
No.
Cynefin is one of the frameworks or methods or schools of complexity. But it's interesting that that shows up on none of the big classical diagrams of the history of complexity theory. I think it's a good start, but I think you have to go outside of that box also to start understanding what complexity really is.
I think it's the way many of us come into it from the agile space.
Yeah,
I think there's a big overlap there.
Yeah,
we used to come in through Stacey. We tend to come in Cynefin nowadays.
Yeah, it's interesting that being a certified Scrum trainer, for whatever that means, there are people who still hit me and say, "Well, do you have a copy of that Stacey diagram?" And Stacey himself, I know a chap who did his PhD a couple of years ago with Stacey. And he says, one thing that Stacey constantly complains about is all the fucking agile people picked on the stuff that I dumped in the mid-90s, and they're still teaching that. Right?
Yeah, it's the same as Scrum.org. I'm a PST too. I keep having to go at them.
Well, we're still talking with each other, but but this is the thing that these are models, and I hate to quote George Box, who says, all models are wrong, some are useful, because that at a meta level reflects George Box's view on the world. And, you know, the box-Leong model I use quite often when I'm doing time series analysis, but still saying that means that Box's view on the world is that all models are wrong. Some are useful, but that's also a subjective interpretation of that. But I notice it's getting a bit late and I've had a couple glasses of wine. So
not be too good.
On the topic, I will add Dan to mention a couple of examples of degree of complexity in relation to Agile. You can have things that are between complex and complicated in Canadian term, so very low degree of complexity. And this is where most of the Agile method works. For example, some technical practices from XP or some practices from Scrum act in the boundary between complex and complicated. Whereas there are other techniques that you go when you want to do innovative stuff are instead at the edge of chaos, between complex and edge of chaos. This is where you innovate more, and sometimes you move in that direction intentionally or sometimes by mistake. So there are different degrees of complexity. In the book, the concept of degree of complexity is a little abused, but again, the idea is to introduce, to go from knowing the theory to introducing the theory into the organization. And so sometimes in the language of the book, you find some simplification that may be useful to introduce those concepts in the practice with the rest of the team. So maybe degree of complexity is an easy way to introduce the concept. And the next step is to allow people to see that there is more language, a broader vocabulary around that. And like George suggested, Kinaving is only one of those. Something that I think you find valuable in the book is that you start to see many other models.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Luca. Yeah, actually, we have done. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean.
Thank you. Thank you, Luca.
Thank you, Luca.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Crowd.
I ran out of wine.
Thank you, Joseph.